It's 105.5 WDHA here on All Mixed Up, and it is my pleasure to welcome back. He's a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, one of my favorite guitar players, Jimmy Messina. Good morning and welcome back to WDHA.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
What's in the coffee cup this morning?
Well, since I turned 50, I don't drink alcohol anymore. So it's just plain old coffee.
I'm usually good for 2.5 cups, especially on Sunday morning. I wanted to talk to you about a bunch of things. I know you're coming to New Jersey in just a couple of weeks for the Rock, Ribs, and Ridges Festival at the Sussex County Fairgrounds. That's the weekend of June 24th, 25th, and 26th. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was country rock. And I just had Richie Furay on. And we talked about how if Poco wasn't in the basement, like the very, very foundation of it, you were certainly on the ground floor of it. Now, you've been living in Tennessee for a number of years, big country music scene. Looking back, how close to the foundation was Poco in country rock?
Well, I'll give you a little story of how this all evolved. Richie and I were in the Buffalo Spring together. I was producing the Last Time Around album. We had just gotten word that the group was not going to stay together, which we were all pretty shocked. And I recall Richie and I in the backseat of a taxi cab. I think we were either going to a guitar store or something together. And I asked him, I said, so what do you want to do when this is over? And he says, I really haven't given it much thought. And I said, well, how would you feel about, us working together and maybe forming a band? And he said, well, I don't know what that would be like. And I said, well, I think folk rock is what Buffalo Springfield was. But I said, I'm not from the folk generation. You might be, but I said, you've written songs like Child's Claim to Fame and Kind Woman, and they all have a real country feeling to it. I said, what if we did something that was more country oriented, more country rock as opposed to folk rock? And he said, well, I don't know. Let's see what happens. So, we go to New York, we cut the record. Stephen doesn't show up for the session. Neil doesn't show up for the flight. Dewey, as we all know, is a very spiritual man and usually arrived very spirited when he did show up and was not really in any position to sing. So we got through that New York session. Arif Mardin was kind enough to get the best musicians in New York. But the best musicians in New York were jazz musicians in those days. Let's just be frank about it. That's who I got. They did the best job that they could do, and which was a great job, but it didn't quite feel like what I felt the Buffalo Springfield needed to sound like, even though Neil had done Broken Arrow with that jazz ending and all that stuff, which was, I listen to it today and I still love it. In fact, I love it most of all about the recording. Nonetheless, came back to Sunset Sound and I was listening to it, Kind Woman, and I said, we need to do something here. I said, maybe we get James Burton back in to either play Dobro or maybe Red Rhodes or Buddy Emmons or Sneaky Pete, somebody. We need to get something to make this feel more country, in my opinion. So Miles Thomas, who was our road tech at that time, guitar roadie. He was a roadie. He was our roadie. There was only one roadie we had. He did it all. He said, guys, he says, I know this young guy back in Denver named Rusty Young. He's really, really a good steel guitar player. He's about your age. And you know what? For the cost of having double or triple scale on one of these musicians, we could, maybe we could fly in here and put him up in a hotel. And I thought, oh yeah, triple scale was at least got $700 or so in those days. And hell, $25 for a hotel room, $50 for a flight. Hey, it all made sense to me. So we brought Rusty in, and on the trip over, airlines dropped his steel, which was a very sophisticated steel, was stainless steel rods and all that stuff. And we didn't know it until we opened it up. And, he didn't cry. He just was devastated. And I said, hey, I got an idea. Stephen, when we were out on the road, bought a steel guitar. I don't know, it's a Fender or something like that. And I said, I'll get it. So we brought it into the studio, and Rusty never said a word, but it was not a very expensive guitar. In fact, I believe it was a double neck. It had an E tuning, which is typical country tuning, and then it had a C tuning, which was a C9 tuning, which was a jazz tuning. And unbeknownst to me until recently, when I went to the memorial at the radio station here in Columbia, Tennessee, I found that Rusty actually started out as a young child playing steel, but learning jazz. His influences and teachers were all jazz players. So that C9 neck was not unfamiliar to him. Now go back to what I was talking about. We're in the studio and the damn E neck doesn't work on Stephen's guitar. So Rusty, again, not saying a word, just tuned up, and the song was in the key of A, and he began to play on this C9 neck, which I didn't know what the hell even a C9 neck was in those days. 2 passes, he plays this unbelievable steel solo. And since his passing, I thought to myself, you know what? I want to learn what that solo was note for note, because at some point in time, I want to put it back into the song. And as I studied it, I went, oh my God, this is going to be difficult. This is, wow, listen to that phrasing. I finally got it. Haven't put it into the set yet. But the point is that I think the culmination of country rock, from my standpoint, having had the privilege of working with both Neil and especially Stephen, who, come on, the man in his day when we were listening and working together had an incredible voice, had a unique voice, had a great writing style, had a sense of country, rock, folk, all tied into one thing with a little bit of blues, made him very unique. And it made the Buffalo Springfield very unique. So now with Richie and I passing into what eventually would become Poco, I believe that is what set the stage for us being able to really look at each other and say, you know what, that idea that we had about maybe doing country rock, maybe this is it. And that was the moment in which I looked over to Richie and actually proposed, this might be that start of that band we wanted to create.
Jim Messina is my guest this morning here at 105.5 WDHA, coming to the Sussex County Fairgrounds, June 24th, 5th, and 6th. He's headlining Sunday night at the Rock, Ribs, and Ridges Festival. You mentioned Rusty coming from a kind of jazz / country with the tunings on the pedal steel guitar. And it kind of anticipated the question I was going to ask you, because I hear you're playing, especially on the Loggins and Messina cuts. I hear you're playing, and I guess it's a thumb pick and bare fingers, and I think of Scotty Moore. And Scotty Moore, of course, came from a jazz / country background. I believe he was on all those Elvis records, of course, and I think he started out, if I'm not mistaken, on a Telecaster, which is the guitar that I always associated with you, again, at least through those early Loggins and Messina days.
Well, I know a little bit of history about Scotty Moore, and I was influenced by Elvis and that sound that he used to get, and also the rhythmic style that he had, which is probably part of what was transferred from the bass player. They used to play a lot of slap bass, right? And of course, Scotty had to fit inside of that, and the only way you could do that would be with finger picking, really. So that's probably true what you're saying. I first became aware of Scotty Moore playing an ES Gibson 295, which was an inexpensive Gibson in those days. And perhaps when he was recording, he played a Telecaster, but once he started working with Elvis, they were mainly Gibsons, and it had a tone of its own. It was a single coil pickup, which sounds more like a Telecaster. And then when he, like all of us, made a little extra money and could afford the good stuff, we went from Chevys to Cadillacs, and then we went from Fenders to Gibsons. So his Super 400 is also one of his sounds. But getting back to the Telecaster, I also loved Buck Owens, and I loved James Burton, and I also loved the rockabilly sounds. And growing up, I was a big fan of Ricky Nelson, Ozzie and Harriet, and I couldn't wait to see the band play on there. And then years later, lo and behold, I'm building a studio with Mike Giroux in around 1966 for a couple of guys from Shreveport, Louisiana, Al Jones and Sonny Jones. We built a studio for them. And lo and behold, once it was finished, they said they had some friends that were in the music business that were going to come over and make some demos. Well, turned out to be Roger Miller, Dorsey Burnett, James Burton, Joe Osborne, Keith Allison, also the guy in the Crickets, Jerry Allison, I think his name was, played drums. So all of a sudden I'm sitting here, this is before Buffalo Springfield, I'm sitting here mixing some of my favorite sounds, looking at the faces who created them. And I'm telling you, the elation that a 18-year-old feels when you're doing that was unbelievable. So it was already getting into my blood, and I was already making friends with James and Joe. So moving into the Buffalo Springfield, as I think about it right now, I think those influences were part of the reasons why I leaned over to Richie and was comfortable enough to say, why don't we try country rock? Because to me, these guys were the early inventors of country rock. They really were. I mean, let's face it, even though it was more blues oriented, it was Elvis Presley's time and it was rock and roll. And they were there, I think, as the forerunners.
You know, every time we get the list of who's being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there's a reaction and sometimes a backlash from fans who say, well, that's not rock and roll. But the way you just described what was going on in that scene, in that studio, like, where do you even begin to define? How do you define what rock and roll is? I've talked to a few people most recently about the Ken Burns country music documentary that I finally had a chance to see. And the lines are so blurred between all of it. And I mean, I could make the argument that Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys were playing rock and roll long before any of us knew what rock and roll even was, let alone tried to define it, Jim.
Well, you know what? You just brought up an important point here. And the lines are very, very thin. I mean, they're also very thin between, you know, flamenco and Cuban and, you know, Latin music, because I love that as well. And I do indulge myself in writing and arranging in that. The lines are very blurred. Rhythms we get out of Africa during that period of time, the percussionists, and both being African or Cuban or Puerto Rican, when we mix these wonderful cultures together rhythmically, we get some very interesting timing and time signatures and things that you're not supposed to be able to write down and do. But I think what's most important about what you just said is that the problem you and I face, myself as an artist trying to make a living, yourself as someone who's trying to advocate music, it's the radio stations and the business that delineate this stuff. They're the ones that put the nomenclature on this and separate us from being who we are, so they can categorize it, package it, sell it to a public who would probably rather just say, just give me the music. I just want to hear it and judge for myself. But they wouldn't be able to make money off of it if they didn't do that. And I mean, that's how that business works. But there are very, very a lot of blurred lines, and as there should be. It's art, really. I mean, you know, when Picasso paints a painting and one moment, you know, he can draw the human body perfectly, and the next moment, all of his faces are square and the noses are all flat. You go, well, does this guy know how to see or not, right? It's art. It's just art.
Jim Messina is with us this morning here at 105.5 WDHA on All Mixed Up. We just had Jeff Baxter on a couple of weeks ago. In addition to being just a ridiculously talented guitar player, he also has done work as a defense consultant and missile systems.
That's what I heard. I heard that back in the old days, but I thought he was just smoking too much hooch.
He told the story about turning this paper into a congressman, Jimmy, and the congressman turned it over to somebody with the government and said, well, who's this from? Somebody at Boeing? And the congressman said, no, he's a guitar player from the Doobie Brothers. Brian May has a doctorate, I think, in astrophysiology. And you may have alluded to this already by talking about building a studio in 1966, going that far back. But what's a side of you that your fans might not know about beyond singing, performing, producing, and writing songs?
Well, I started out like everybody else wanting to be a musician when I was, 6 years old. But I've also had a love for electronics all my life, and I was building radios and stuff when I was a kid. When I was supposed to be in bed, I'd taken toilet paper and copper wire and crystals and headphones and made antennas sitting outside. When the parents went to sleep, I'd plug in my headphones and listen to radio. But I've always been intrigued with electronics. I worked under Mike Durow in 1965. I was hired by Ibis Records, then owned by Glenn Edwards, who was a DJ working at KEZY Radio at the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim. And somehow he got a hold of me, asked me if I would go to work as a producer for him. And hell, I was 17 years old. And I said, what is that? And he goes, well, that's what am I supposed to do? And he says, well, I want you to come to the studio. I want you to listen to the musicians that I have. They'll have songs. I want you to hear them playing them. And if something needs to change, or is the wrong chord, or whatever you think needs to happen, or slow it down, or you make those decisions. I'll give you an engineer. And when you're ready, you tell them to press record, and that's what I want you to do. So I said, okay, I'll take that. Sounds like a lot of fun. So I worked for him for a year, and Mike Durow, who was the engineer at the studio at Emperor Productions, which was owned by Bob Hudson and Lambert. He was also a famous DJ on KRLA in the 60s. So that's where I kind of got my start as a producer. After the record label folded, I thought, well, I'm gonna become a musician. But that's when I ran into James Burton, Glenn Campbell, guys like Hal Blaine, Earl Palmer, Lyle Ritz, the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
And these people could read, fly spots on fly paper. And I was not that educated in reading that fast. And so I just thought, I'm never going to make it. So I decided to apprentice under Mike Durow. Now, Mike Durow is a name that we were both just as poor as church mice. And whenever we got a job, he'd buy dinner, I'd buy dinner, and, so sleep on couches and all the stuff you have to do to make it. But I eventually got a job working at a studio called Audio Arts. Audio Arts was owned by Madeline Baker. Madeline Baker was the publisher for Jimmy Webb.
Wow.
Jimmy Webb and I went to high school together. He graduated in 1964. I graduated in 1965. So Mike Durow got a job working there. He hated it. Called me up and says, hey, I'd like you to come down to the studio. He says, there might be some work for you here. So I came down, and I'm, there on a break, and I'm looking around, and I'm looking at the studio, and he says, how'd you like to work here? And I said, I think I would. He says, I've got some other things I need to do. And I'm looking around the studio, and I noticed that there's Don Loudermouser, Tony McCashin, and some other guy with a beard in there. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm recording some demos for this guy named Kenny Loggins. I said, is he the one with the beard? He goes, yeah. He says, I said, he sounds pretty good. He goes, yeah, he's a bit of an ego freak, but he's pretty talented. And that was the first time I saw Kenny Loggins. and
That's a heck of an introduction.
I know. And I kind of went, oh, I didn't know if that was a good ad. So anyway, I got the job. He went on. Later on, he calls me from Sunset Sound Recorders and says, I think this might be a good studio for you to work at. So I came down, met Teddy Camarada, and Teddy interviewed me, and he says, I'm thinking of building a second studio here. In fact, I am building a second studio, is what he said. And he said, I need a second engineer. And Mike Durow says that he's too busy. Would you consider the job? And I said, absolutely. So they built the studio and I went to work. Bruce Botnick was the first engineer, worked Studio One. I was the second engineer, Studio Two. And that's about the time I met the Buffalo Springfield. So I was going to be an engineer. I figured I'll be around music, I'll be around people that I love to hear and work with. And I'd already gone through the experience with Burton and Joe Osborne working in the studios. And I figured this is where I'm going to make my life. And that's what I had decided until the Buffalo Springfield decided to hire me also, not only as the engineer and producer, but as their bass player. And that's what got me back into music again.
Talking with Jim Messina this morning on All Mixed Up at 105.5 WDHA. You mentioned Kenny Loggins. You're doing a couple of shows. He won't be with you at the Sussex County Fairgrounds, but you are doing a couple of shows later on this summer, I believe, on the West Coast. If two people were ever meant to perform together, it's you and Kenny. Your voice is very, very reminiscent of those harmonies of the Everly Brothers, Jim.
I know, it's funny because Kenny and I had decided to do the 2005 reunion, and he asked me to join him in Santa Barbara for a benefit he was doing for Christmas Unity. And we did the show. I mean, I sat in for 3 or 4 songs. We did the show, and afterwards he says, I've had a lot of brilliant singers work with me and sing with me. He said, but when you and I sing together, there's nothing that can match it. And I don't know what that is. It's a tonality, it's a blend, and it's the same for me. When I sing with some really great singers and we sing the same songs, it sounds good, but when he and I sing, there's something special about it.
There's no question about it. How much, well, I don't even know if that's the right way to start to phrase the question. Your career has been so varied. You mentioned, Buffalo Springfield and Poco, and you had a solo career that's been successful. The flamenco, you did an entire record, if I'm not mistaken, or more of flamenco. When it comes time to put the set list together, as you will, for Rock, Ribs, and Ridges, what do you put into it? What do you, I think I need to leave this one out. How do you do that?
Well, I just recently, having moved to Tennessee in the last 4 years, it's making it very difficult for me I have got wonderful players. I've worked for years on the West Coast and on the East Coast, but living here in Tennessee and needing to rehearse and to make those steps forward to make my sets more interesting and evolve, I've had to look around to sub these guys with players around here. And I've almost have everybody. In fact, I probably do have everybody. I can now begin rehearsing here for some new material. Right now, what you'll see is it Rock, Ribs, and Ridges?
Yes.
Rock, Ribs, and Ridges. You're going to see a really wonderful set of songs, from Buffalo Springfield, Poco, Loggins Messina, my solo stuff, just as you mentioned. And I will start out acoustically. So we'll get those tunes like Pooh Corner and Watching the River Run and all that stuff in there. And then we'll start moving into the area of where the country rock began, when you'll hear songs like Kind Woman, or You Better Think Twice, listen to a country song, Holiday Hotel, when the energy starts to come up. And then I break into, after that, into like the trilogy where you've got Loving Me, Make a Woman Feel Woman, Peace of Mind, into Be Free, and then into Angry Eyes, and then into some of the You Need a Man, which is very Latin rock based. And the whole set is designed to bring and lift the audience up out of their seats. So that's what I plan to do there. And subsequent to that, I want to start getting into some of my solo stuff. And now I have a really great saxophone player who also plays percussion. I have Jack Bruno, who used to work with Tina Turner, Joe Cocker, Delbert McClinton. He's just a phenomenal groove player. And as I said, Stevie Nieves is very Latin based in his music. So we'll begin to get some of that newer stuff in. I'm hoping by 2023, I'll have some stuff added to the set. I'll have to wean out a little of the Springfield stuff or Poco stuff, but it'll start to become more me, which is what, not so much that more me is important, but I would like to get some of my solo works out there that
Sure.
I'm very proud of,
You can check in with all things Jim Messina at jimmessina.com. And if you're interested in more information on Rock, Ribs, and Ridges, you can go to their website, rockribsandridges.com. It's June 24th, 5th, and 6th at the Sussex County Fairgrounds, and Jim headlining the Sunday night show on the 26th. I can't thank you enough for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation catching up with you again, Jim.
Great.
Thank you
We'll
so
see
much.
you soon. Hopefully we'll see you there.